Peace, peace. This your host, Selah-Shalom. And this is the Cosmon Teachings in the words of Jehovah and his angel ambassadors from the Cosmon Bible OAHSPE. And the topic of discussion today is called the progression of mortals from primate to upright. Now, many believe that when mortals were created, they were somehow already knowledgeable of things. But here I'm going to show how the mortal race started off primitive in the early days of mortals' beginning. Just as a baby comes into the world mentally blank, physically weak, and the baby has no knowledge of speech, no language, the baby is not capable of walking, but must crawl before it learns to walk. These conditions were the same for mortals in the beginning, and the Creator leaves these examples before us to prove the progression of things. So everything shows development and growth. Now, in the beginning, mortals were in a very similar condition as stated in the first book of the First Lords, chapter 1, verse 4, where it states, verse 4, "And the name of the first race was Asu, or Adam, because they were of the earth only." Keep that in mind. And this is reference to primitive man, Homo erectus. And when it states of the earth only, meaning the first race were not capable of heavenly inspiration. The same way you can't go tell a lion or a gorilla about cosmological order, they can't comprehend it. They can't register it. Their brain is not developed for that. It hasn't evolved to that. And even today, the brain is not developed. So there had to be an intervention for man to have heavenly inspirations. Now, and to show how mortals were primitive in the beginning, in the book of Inspiration, chapter 6, verse 17 through 21, it states, "And when the earth was ripe for man, then I created him. Male and female created I those of the second creation." Verse 18, "And man was dumb like other animals, without speech and without understanding, even less than any other creature which I had created." Verse 19, "Nevertheless, I had given to man, and thus made him out of the dissolved elements of every living thing that preceded him." So basically saying the physical makeup of man comes from everything of the earth, from the vegetable kingdom, the mineral kingdom, and the animal kingdom. Verse 20, "Man partook of the first and second creation, after the manner of every animal on the earth. So created I man, with all the characteristics of all of them. So created I him, male and female created I them." Verse 21, "And man was unconscious of his creation," just like a baby is unconscious of his creation, "not knowing whence he came, nor knew he which was his own species." Just like a baby don't know where he came from. He just came and he's into the world. He don't know who he is. Such was the nature of mortals in the beginning, showing you that mortals didn't start off knowledgeable or already having a knowledge coming into the world. And being that all mortals at that time were in this condition, there were no mortal capable of teaching other mortals about rising above this primitive state that they were living in. Because in order to rise above a primitive state, you would need someone to teach you how to become civil. See that? And this is where the angels come in at. Because it was the angels that taught mortals how to clothe their nakedness. It was the angels that taught mortals speech and language. But prior to the angels coming to lift them up, they were in these primitive conditions. In OAHSPE, it states that they were living in these primitive conditions for 6,000 years before the angels came to the earth, as stated in the first book of the First Lords, verse 2 and 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. Verse 1. "Of the time of inhabitation for Asu was 8,000 years. So from his creation to his extinction was 8,000 years. Asu, or the Adamites, or Homo erectus. "And they survived 2,000 years after the time of the birth of the Ions," basically the pygmies and the Twas, the little people. Which is to say, Asu dwelt on the earth 6,000 years. There were your 6,000 years. "And then conceive of the chosen of God," being a Twa, the pygmy, the little people. "And after that survive yet 2,000 years. So here this verse renders up the time that the primitive race existed before they conceive of the chosen of God, which was 6,000 years. And the conceiving of the chosen of God is referring to the Ions, or the pygmies, which was the crossbreed between primitive man and angels. So it is clear that mortals were in a primitive state in the beginning of their existence. Now, 6,000 years after the creation of mortals, the earth entered into the ark of Wan. And during an ark cycle, the angels descend to the earth to help mortals in their progression on earth. And these angels are the first set of angels that came to the earth to assist mortals in their progression, as stated in the book of Synopsis of 16 Cycles, chapter 1, verse 5 and 6. It states, verse 5, at the time of the creation of man, as shown here on the chart, the earth was traveling in the Ark of Wan, where dwelt thousands of Orion chiefs, with thousands of millions of high-raised angels. Verse 6, the holy council of Orion chiefs, through the wisdom and voice of Jehovah, appointed one of their own, Sententes, to take charge of the earth and to people it with immortal beings during its travel in Wane, the Ark of Wane. Keynote, here it states to people it with immortal beings. Remember, Asu was of the earth only. He had no capability of heavenly inspiration. So he was not capable of immortality. The Homo erectus wasn't. Now the key word here states to people it with immortal beings. Prior to the angels coming to the earth, mortals were not capable of being immortal because they were of the earth only, as stated earlier in the book of the First Lords. Now, verse 7. Moving on to verse 7, same chapter, book of Sententes, chapter 1, verse 7 now. The rank and title of Sententes, thus raised by Jehovah, creator of worlds, was first God of the earth and her heavens. So Sententes was the first God to rule over the earth and her heavens, starting the 3,000-year arc cycle periods. Verse 8, and Sententes came with millions of angels who had been raised up from other worlds previously. See that? And he accomplished his works and was known as God. So when Sententes came with his millions of angels, these were angels that was raised up on other planetary worlds, that graduated off of that planetary world and are moving throughout the cosmos, and was commanded through Jehovah, through Sententes, to come to the planet. And this is what we would call extraterrestrials or angelical beings coming to a primitive people. Verse 9, Sententes was then the first God of the earth and her heavens, and his place was within the Ark of Wane. This is the first arc cycle after the creation of man. And during his cycle of 3,000 years, he raised up from the earth 1,500 million brides and bridegrooms to Jehovah. What that verse right there is saying is that an Etherian angel rules over an arc cycle for 3,000 years. So all the spirits of the dead that graduate off the earth within that arc cycle of 3,000 years will go to that archangel's heavenly residence in the course of that 3,000 years. That's basically 15 billion brides and bridegrooms ascending to Sententes' heavenly plateau within the arc cycle he reigned. Just to give you an example. See, I'm dealing with this is high science, so you got to catch up and catch on, because I went through the explanation of these in past videos. So if you're hearing this for the first time, you're probably like, damn, what are you talking about? But go back and check the videos to get an understanding. So here, this verse is to show that angels came to the first primitive mortal race 6,000 years after their creation, when the earth was traveling in the Ark of Wan, the first arc cycle after the creation of man, a 3,000-year period which began the records of mortals belonging to this planet, based off 3,000-year cycles. And this was the first arc cycle. You may hear me say the flood took place in the 17th arc cycle after the creation of mortals. Or you may hear me say that the pyramids were built during the 23rd arc cycle after the creation of mortals. So this verse above states that this was the first arc cycle after the creation of mortals when the angels came. Now here is a verse describing the angels appearing to the primitive mortals, coinciding with the previous verses. Now in the book of Jehovah chapter 6 verse 14 through 16, it states, verse 14, there are lightened upon the new earth. Now this is during the time the earth is traveling in the Ark of Wane, where Jehovah commanded the angels to descend down. So this is what this verse is basically referring to. Verse 14, there are lightened upon the new earth millions of angels from heaven, but many of them had never fulfilled the corporeal life, having died in infancy. And these angels comprehended not procreation nor corporeal life. Now this is a very important thing to understand. These angels never lived a corporeal life, meaning think about the thousands of children that died through infancy, or died through miscarriage, or died through abortion. They never lived a corporeal life, but in spirit they continue to grow into an adult like they would have in corporeal life or in physical life. So these angels that are coming to the planet in this time period are angels who never experienced a physical life. They only experienced a spiritual life. So this is their first time experiencing physicality. I have to make that clear because these are the angels that fell and interbred with Asu. And we're going to get into that. Now, this is a very important verse because it's telling you that some of the angels never experienced a corporeal life, meaning they never lived in the flesh. So with that being said, they will be lacking corporeal knowledge. Keep this in mind. Verse 15, and I said, go ye and deliver Asu from darkness, for he shall also rise in spirit to inherit my Etherian worlds. Verse 16, and now was the earth in the later days of Simu. Simu is the time of creation. That's the first age, and the later days meaning closer to the ending of the age of Simu. Simu lasts 144,000 years. Each age is broken down into two halves to 72,000 years. This is the second half of 72,000 years of the first age, 6 Gadar period, as shown on the chart. And the angels could readily take on corporeal bodies for themselves. So at this particular time in the arc cycle, the angels could take on corporeal bodies. Out of the elements of the earth clothed they themselves by the force of their will with flesh and bones. By the side of the Asuans, the Adamites, the Homo erectus, primitive man, took they on corporeal forms. See that? So the angels clothed themselves with flesh and bone, which in return blood. And by the side of primitive man or primitive mortals, they took on flesh. So here is getting interesting because these angels who never lived a corporeal life, along with the angels who did live a corporeal life, by the force of their will manifested into flesh and bones. They physically appeared before primitive men as help makers. We're dealing with two factors now. We're dealing with the angels who have lived a corporeal life, and we're dealing with angels who never fulfilled a corporeal life. So we're dealing with experienced angels and at the same time inexperienced angels in this particular environment. Now, to show another verse where this happened is in the first book of the first Lords, chapter 1, verse 2. It states, and the Lord brought the angels of heaven to man. By his side took they on forms like unto man, having all the organs and attributes of mortals. For it was the time of the earth for such things to be. This is referring to the beginning of the inhabitable time for mortals, when this thing took place. So like the verse said, these angels had all the organs attributed to mortals. So they materialized. These angels became flesh and blood. So now again, the purpose of the angels coming to primitive mortals was to educate them on who they are and to teach them the ways of living civil. Now you know it's a saying in the black community that we civilized the white race from being uncivilized or being primitive or being savage and barbarian, or to put it simple, from primitive to civil. But the same rules apply for us. Who raised up the black race from primitive? Because you can't go against the fact that all things come into the world mentally blank. So if we civilize the white race, it's because somebody civilized us. Who are they that civilized us? See that? See how that works? But here in OAHSPE, it's showing you that it was the angels that civilized us in the beginning, from primitive to civil. I just wanted to add that because this is a hot topic in the black community when dealing with civilization. But no one of the black community ever questioned who raised up the black man and woman from primitive to civil. But let's move on. That's just food for thought. Now, here is another verse explaining how the angels appeared to primitive mortals in the beginning to help lift them up out of ignorance and darkness. In the book of Inspiration, chapter 6, verse 22 and 23, it states, verse 22, and I sent angels to man to teach him who he was and to rouse him up to his capabilities for which I created him. See that? You ever came across a cat who got a particular talent that he don't know how to exercise his own talent, but you see the potential in him and you help bring it out of him? That's basically what the angels was trying to do to the primitive man. Verse 23, and many angels drew from man's side substance is minerals, and thus took on corporeal forms. And the angels dwelt with man as helpmates to make man understand. So here is the purpose of the angels coming to primitive mortals, to make primitive mortals aware of who they are and to show them how to use their own capabilities. No different when you teach a baby of how to use their own capabilities and to teach them of who they are. These same things happen to primitive mortals in the beginning, and teaching a baby takes hard work and invested time. So these angels were working hard and had many times invested to help lift primitive man. Now, as I mentioned earlier when it stated about the conceiving of the children of God and the interbreeding between primitive man and angels, this was a result of the angels who died in infancy and never lived a flesh life, So they were the ones that were tempted. But the angels that did fulfill a flesh life on their whatever native planet that they came from were not tempted and held fast to the oath given as to be teachers to uplift primitive man and not to fool around with primitive man. Now in the book of Jehovah chapter 6 verse 17 through 20, it explains how the angels interbred with primitive man. Now some may ask, how can angels crossbreed with mortals? As the verse stated earlier, they clothe themselves with flesh and bone, which means that they were carrying genetics in their physical makeup. What you're going to have to come to terms with is that we are part angelical based off this act in the beginning. Now, verse 17, and I said, go ye forth and partake of all that is on the earth, but partake ye not of the tree of life, lest in that labor ye become procreators and as if dead to the heavens whence ye came. So here it clearly states that not to procreate with primitive mortals, or you will become bound through the blood of the offspring with primitive man. So these angels were flesh and blood, no different than how we are right now. The angels were. Verse 18, but those who had never learned corporeal things, being imperfect in wisdom, comprehended not Jehovah's words, and they dwelt with the Asuans, the primitive man, and were tempted, as they were naked, and partook of the fruit of the tree of life. The tree of life is the penis and the vagina. That's what gives life to continue the races of mortals. And lo and behold, they saw their own nakedness, meaning they saw their offspring. They saw their own, what they did, they saw their children. After 9 months, they saw their own nakedness. They saw their own flesh and blood. And there was born of the first race being the Homo erectus, the Adamites, a new race called man, being Homo sapien, thinking man, because the new race that came from the crossbreed were a step smarter than primitive man. And Jehovah took the earth out of the travel of Simu. Simu is the time of creation, or the ark of Wayne, right on the borderline of the time of creation and the time of habitation that's taking place. And the angels gave up their corporeal bodies. So here it states a new race was born because of the interbreeding between primitive man and the angels. And when it states that they saw their own nakedness, it is referring to their offspring that came in from their own loins, if male or female from their womb. See that? Verse 19. Jehovah said, because ye have raised up those that shall be joint heirs in heaven, ye shall tread the earth with your feet and walk by the sides of the newborn, being guardian angels over them. For they are of your own flesh and kin. See that? Verse 20. Fruit of your seed have I quickened with my spirit, and man shall come forth with the birthright to my Etherian worlds. See that? Jehovah ain't put no curse on them and, oh, you curse for this and nah. He said you're going to become bound to your offspring, and you're going to guide them and teach them, and they're going to become inheritors of the Etherian worlds. So he's just showing more expansion in his kingdom. And what you thought was a mistake, nah, go ahead, have that. That's a simple thing. So here it shows that the angels are to be guardian over their own offspring. And this legend about angels interbreeding with mortals is found nearly in all indigenous belief systems. Now the difference between the first race and the new race being the second race is that the second race is capable of heavenly spiritual discernment compared to the first race who are incapable of spiritual discernment. As stated in the first book of the First Lords, chapter 1, verse 3 and 4 states, verse 3, and it came to pass that a new race was born on the earth, and these were called Ions, pygmies and Twas, basically, because they were begotten of both heaven and earth. And hence it became a saying, the earth conceived of the Lord. Verse 4, and the name of the first race was Asu, because they were of the earth only. And the name of the second race was Ion, because they were capable of being taught spiritual things. Why? Because of the blood interbreeding of the angels and of Asu. So here it states the new race are capable of heavenly inspiration, and that they are conceived of both primitive man, primitive mortals, and angels, which gave the advantage over the first race, who were of the earth only, capable of no heavenly inspiration. Now coming back to the verse earlier, where it states in the first book of the First Lords, chapter 2, verse 1, the time of habitation of Asu, or primitive man, was 8,000 years. And then he survived 2,000 years after the time of the birth of the Ions, which is to say, Asu dwelt on the earth 6,000 years, then conceived of the children of God, and after that survived yet 2,000 years. So now you can get a better picture of this. So now you can get a better picture of this verse. From the creation of primitive man to the coming of the angels in the ark of Wayne was 6,000 years. So mortals were in darkness and ignorance for 6,000 years. When the angels came, they conceived of the chosen of God, referring to the second race, being the crossbreed between primitive man and the angels, being the pygmy race, the Twa, the little people, chosen of God. Because this new race is capable of being inspired with spiritual inspiration, unlike the first primitive race who are not capable of spiritual inspirations. It's like trying to explain to a gorilla about cosmological order and how worlds are created and governed. The gorilla will look at you with no idea what you're talking about, because his mental capacity is not capable of receiving such intelligence. Such was it with the first primitive mortal race. That's why they describe them as being of the earth only. And it was the angels that gave mortals their first language, as stated in the first book of the First Laws, chapter 4, verse 1 through 4, where it states, "About this time man began to use his lips and tongue in inoculating words, prior to which he spoke in the thorax." And the thorax is in the chest region. He uttered sounds, ooh, oh. That was the speech of man in the beginning before he was able to use his lips and tongue. See that? Something simple like that we overlook. Just like a baby. Look how an infant child, when it begins to utter sounds, it utters from its chest. It utters from its chest's gut region. It doesn't speak from its mouth and tongue, showing you the parallel with man in the beginning. Verse 2, "And the Lord spoke unto the iron, saying, that thy labor of the Lord thy God may be remembered on earth, go provide me a stone, and I will engrave it with my own hand, and it shall be called Simon, because it shall be a testimony unto all nations and peoples of the earth, of the first written language in all the world." Verse 3, "And the Ions, which are the pygmies and the Twa, the little people, prepared a stone, and hewed it flat, and then polished it smooth. And the Lord came down in the night and engraved it. And the Lord explained it. Through his angels taught he the Ions, the pygmies and the Twa, the little people, the meaning of the characters engraving thereon." Verse 4, "And the Lord said, Go into all cities and all countries of the world, and provide ye copies like unto the tablet I have given." So it came to pass the angels of heaven inspired the Ions to make tablets and to read them, that the first language of the earth, Pan, might be preserved to the races of men. And it was so. So here you can see that it was the angels that gave and interpreted man language. And then man had to learn the language, memorize it, and then go out and preach it or spread it to the other tribes and nations throughout the planet or throughout the world. And the proof of this is with the Dogons. When the Nomos came down and they gave the Dogons glyphs and told them to interpret it. See that? It was hand delivered. So here you can see how mortals are beginning to progress from primitive to civil, and the teachers are the angels. See that? And with that, I'd like to say peace and blessings. Shalom.